Hello again, everyone. I hope you're all doing fine. So now we will continue part 3 of chapter 25. So in this chapter, we're going to talk about the functions of the Fed, the money demand, and the interest rate and bonds. So let's start. So first of all, we're going to talk about the functions of the Fed. I know we talked about this before in chapter 24, but here we're going to talk about more functions. So first of all, let's review what is the central bank. As we said in the previous part, the central bank is the main bank in the country. It controls the money supply and it's responsible of all the commercial banks because we said before that commercial banks would bring in their reserves to the Fed. So let's move to the main functions of the Fed. The first one is, as we said before, it controls the money supply. And also, the Fed clears interbank payments, which means that the Fed is responsible of exchange rates staying fixed. So, in many countries, the exchange rates must stay fixed. So, the Fed would take control over this. And also, the Fed assists banks that are in difficult problems by providing loans. So the Fed would help commercial banks when they're facing hard times by providing loans or by, for example, decreasing the required reserve ratio. Also, the Fed puts the required reserve ratio that all commercial banks should follow. So, as we said before, that all commercial banks should keep a minimum fraction of reserves aside legally. So, the Fed decides what is the ratio of this fraction. So, the Fed decides how much the commercial banks should put aside. Now let's talk a little bit about money and bonds. So the advantage of holding money is liquidity because as we said, the money that we hold outside the bank, the currency that we hold outside the bank is the most liquid form of money because like it's in our pockets, we can use them directly for transactions. And the disadvantage of holding money is the interest rate because when we hold money, we're giving up on the interest rate that we could have earned if we put that money in the bank. So the opportunity cost of holding our money is giving up on the interest rate. Okay, now let's talk about bonds. The advantages of bonds is that it pays interest rate. So when you sell a bond, you're going to get paid an interest rate. And the disadvantage would be not liquid. So if you own a bond, it's not very easy to transfer it into cash. So that's why the bond is not liquid. Okay, now we have this equation, we saw it before, which is reserves equal to required reserve plus excess reserve. And if you want to calculate the required reserve alone, it is equal to the required reserve ratio times deposits. And we assumed in this chapter that that banks held no ER. So we assumed that the reserves is equal to required reserves and the excess reserves is equal to 0. Okay. So in this case, we have the following equation, which is the change in deposits is going to be equal 1 over required reserve ratio, which is a small r, times the change in reserves. Okay, so here we have a quick example. So assume that reserves is equal to $100 and the required reserve ratio is equal to 20%. So if you want to estimate the change in deposit, it's going to be 1 over 0.20 times 100 and it will give us $500. Okay, now let's talk about money demand. So the shifts in money demand will occur under two conditions. The first condition is when there's a change in income, which is Y, or when there's a change in price level, which is P. Okay, so let's take an example on how a change in Y can affect the demand for money. So assume there's an increase in Y, like an increase in income. So this will lead to an increase in transactions, which will lead to an increase in spending because, of course, when we have more income, we're going to spend more. Okay, and this will increase the demand for money. On the other hand, if you want to give an example of how a change in price level can change the demand for money, assume that there's an increase in the price level. So households will continue to buy goods and services, but for higher prices. So this will increase the demand for money. So as we saw in both conditions, there's a positive relationship or a direct relationship between the price level and the income and money demanded, because we saw that an increase in P and the increase in Y will both lead to an increase in money demanded. Okay, but on the other hand, there's a negative relationship between the interest rate and the money demanded, because an increase in interest rate will lead to a decrease in money demanded, because when there's a high interest rate, people will prefer to keep their money in the bank and benefit from interest rate instead of withdrawing it and spending. Okay, so that's why an increase in R will lead to a decrease in money demanded, and therefore will form a negative relationship. Okay, now let's see the graph of the money demand as a function of interest rate. So here the money demand curve is downward sloping, and if you want to draw the money supply curve is going to be vertical, because the central bank has a full control over it, as we said in the functions of the Fed. Okay, so the money supply curve will be vertical and the money demand curve will be downward sloping. So an increase in price or an increase in Y, as we said in the previous slide, will lead to an increase in money demanded. So here, if we look at the graph, if we shift M0 to M1, this will shift R from R0 to R1 downwards. Okay, so which means that an increase in money demanded will lead to a decrease in the interest rate. Okay, so an increase in P or an increase in Y will lead to a decrease in the interest rate. So here, as a conclusion, increase in money demanded will lead to a decrease in the interest rate. Okay, finally, let's talk about the interest rate on bonds. The interest rate on bonds, if we want to calculate it, it's going to be coupon payments over price. Okay, and the coupon can be changed. So if you want to increase or decrease the interest rate, we can only change the price. Okay, so this part of the equation, which is coupon payments, cannot be changed. It's always constant. Okay, so if you want to change or adjust the interest rate on bonds, we must only change the price. So the only option we have is to change the price if we want to adjust the interest rate on bonds. Okay, and here, as the market interest rate increases, this will lead to a reduction in the price of existing bonds. So there's a negative relationship between price of existing bonds and the market interest rate. So when the interest rate increases, it means that we have less price. Okay, so that's why there's a negative relationship or an indirect relationship between the price of existing bonds and the market interest rate. Okay, so if you want to increase the interest rate on bonds, what should we do? We should decrease, sorry, if you want to, yes, increase the interest rate on bonds, we should decrease the price. And on the other hand, if you want to decrease the interest rate on bonds, we must increase the price of existing bonds. So that was part 3 of chapter 25. We have one more part, so keep updated for it, and I hope you enjoyed this lesson.